Hello, welcome back. I'm Aidan Swan, and this is Ink for Artists, where I test ink from the point of view of an artist. Today, we are testing white. Now, I have tried many different white inks over the years, and today we are going to have a look at a few of those. Now, the big issue with white is that it separates. You leave it alone for 2.5 minutes and you have a thick layer of white in the bottom of the bottle and all of the liquid in the top again. So obviously you need to mix it up. However, do not shake it, because when you shake it, it just fills up with bubbles, which complicates matters. So you need to stir it. And here I'm using my trusty old porcupine quill. We're going to work slightly differently to how we usually do. I'm going to do all of the tests in duplicate. So there's going to be one test on plain black paper, and the other test is on white paper on which I have painted a very, very thick layer of ink. In this case, it is Mont Blanc Permanent Black, and we need to see how these inks respond over a black background that doesn't move and over a water-based ink, since mostly we are going to be working over water-based inks. I do also, first up, apologise for the weirdness in the filming of this one. I got new tech, a new tripod thingy, and it's wonderful. However, I'm not totally happy with the holder for my phone, so I'm sorry that I cut the top off in places, and I bumped it a few times. I do hope that doesn't make you motion sick. Next time I will have this perfected. So let's start. The Windsor Newton immediately paints on very heavily. It has a very weird texture. It's quite scratchy. It doesn't go on very smoothly. There's sort of lumps and ripples in it. And you don't get a very opaque white. It's far less pigment than it initially looks like. It does, however, smooth out very nicely with water, but then obviously you're going to lose a lot of the opacity. But I'm trying wet on dry and wet on wet. Onto the ink paper. It immediately soaks up the ink. You can see there that the second that ink goes on, it just sucks it up and you lose all of the white. So now working wet on wet, obviously you just exaggerate that issue. The FW goes on, like with the pen, beautifully smoothly. It's not the most opaque, however it is a lovely smooth ink. I used to use this when I was in college and I was airbrushing. It is an airbrush ink, it's brilliant for that. But I don't feel that it's a great painter's ink. However, you do know my thoughts about acrylic inks. Acrylic inks are not for painters. But when you need to add white, then obviously you are going to try whatever goes. Onto the ink background, and it soaks up the background as quickly as the Windsor Newton does. And you can see in places with the FW that the pigment separates out a little. Onto the sennelier. Now, sennelier, you've got to be really careful when you stir it, because if you get bubbles in, those bubbles stay. And I was a bit hasty with my stirring. I should have used a small spoon instead of the porcupine quill, because yes, I did get bubbles in it. The sennelier, however, goes on far more opaque than the other two immediately. The other thing about shellac inks is that you've got to be really careful what water you use with them. If you use tap water with chlorine in, they do curdle and separate. I'm using spring water. Our spring water is very good. Or you can use distilled water. There is also a medium for shellac inks. The sennelier ink is an ink that I actually used for years. It's the one that was my go-to until I started using gouache or tempera. So out of the three, this one is my favorite. Working with the sennelier over the ink background, it goes on beautifully smoothly and it doesn't soak in quite as much of the background as the other two do. However, those bubbles that unfortunately landed up in it are far more obvious. Because of the shellac, they don't dissipate like they do in the two water-based acrylics. Now, I love the FW shimmers. I use them frequently in my work. I think that they're absolutely beautiful. And the thing is that when you are working them over black paper, you can see the white ground. However, when you are working them over ink, as you see here, the ground dissipates and you are just left with the shimmer, which is exactly what you want actually. So these are brilliant for adding a little bit of sparkle to an ink painting. They are, as I previously said, acrylic though, so once they're there, they don't move, which can be a problem. Later on in this video, I will show you other options. Now for the gouache. I moved over to gouache about a year back, and I'm using sennelier gouache. Daniel Smith is also fantastic. I found that gouache fills the gaps of needing to add white to an ink painting and needing it to be opaque, but also needing it to move, because I like to rework things. So with the acrylic inks, once they're there, they're there. You can't soften them, where with a gouache you can. On the ink ground, it does go on very well and very heavily. It obviously does soak in some of the back, but not nearly as much as any of the other options. And obviously you can rework. Now I'm going to try a second layer of each one. I want to see how many layers it'll take for us to get opaque, and to see exactly how they rework in wet on dry. The Windsor Newton, obviously it's an acrylic ink, does not move very much and immediately soaks up the backing again. The FW, very similar, not quite as much as the Windsor Newton. Sennelier. more opaque immediately. Let's see what happens, because it did take longer to soak up the back. And no movement. The shimmer, we have a lot more shimmer, obviously. It's nice to see how many layers you'll need to work up to get a good shimmer. And the gouache did soak in the ground eventually. So let's do layer 2 and see what happens there. And obviously, since it's gouache, you can rework it wet on dry. Now, working wet on dry on the black paper where you'll really see if it does pick up. So the Windsor Newton, there is some of the pigment that does move, and it is definitely less opaque in those areas where the pigment's picked up. FW, there's a tiny bit of pickup too, but it doesn't change the opacity. Sennelier, no movement whatsoever. The shimmer, no movement. On the gouache, as with the other test, obviously you can rework gouache. It's often recommended to use a fixative over ink or watercolour paintings before you add white. So I've used this fixative many times. I've found needs usually about 3 coats to really work. I've only used 1 here. I'm going to add a 3rd block on the far right of each so we can see how much the fixative does restrain the colour. And now we're on to our 3rd coat on each. The fixative in only 1 coat over such thick ink really actually doesn't do anything, I don't think. A beautiful alternative to the shimmer inks are shimmer watercolours. I've got a set of Daniel Smith dots here that I got a while back that I'd like to try as an alternative along with the Daler Rowney shimmers. You can see that I have used the lilac a lot. It's my absolute favourite, but I'm going to try a few of them. Let's start with the lilac. You do need to put these on fairly thick to get a nice shade. So I'm trying the lilac, the red, the white, the silver, the garnet, and the scarab red. Now that we have all of our test samples dry, let's have a look at them. The Windsor Newton immediately sucked up all of the backing ground. Regardless of how many layers we did, it sucked it up. It is also a far less dense ink than the others. The FW soaked up most of the backing, but on the 3rd layer we did get some white coming through. It is a very good solid ink that does not move though if you're working on a black backing. The Sennelier was by far the best of the 3 inks. It was lovely and opaque on the black after 1 layer, and after 3 layers we did get a totally opaque white on the ink ground. The shimmer, we got a beautiful range of shimmers on both of the papers. This is, as I've said, one of my favourites, so I can heartily recommend. And I do love the Daniel Smith Shimmer watercolours too, because the thing is that with them you can rework those shimmers back into your painting, which means that you'll get a softer shimmer. I'm a bit disappointed with the white and the silver. They're both just silver. The lavender red and the garnet are absolutely lovely, and I'm sad that the scarab doesn't have more red in it. My wholehearted recommendation for using white with inks is gouache. I've tried a bunch of different brands of gouache, and Sennelier and Daniel Smith are my favorites. They're both super high quality gouache. The Sennelier is about half the price of the Daniel Smith, however it is harder to get hold of. I do hope that this video was useful to you. You may have noticed that there is one ink which is commonly used which is left out, which is the Phil Martins. That is nigh on impossible to get in my country. I've been trying for a while. It is, however, from what I've found out, just gouache. So use gouache. It's all good. It's easily accessible, it works beautifully, and it's simple to use. Now, this video has gone on quite long enough, I think, so I'm not going to be doing a painting. However, here are two of my works where I do use white ink of various forms. I hope that you all have a wonderful week and paint well.